there's a very good document of it. If you want to go out, it's findable on the internet. It's all been declassified, describing every single test the United States had. And you know there were 2 in Mississippi? Oh, someone knows that. Good. So you're the first person to find who knew about those. Farmington, there was one out in Alaska. Some really interesting things. With one other interesting thing is there's a footnote on the first page. I found it interesting, whether you call it humorous or not. It says below, at the bottom, it says there were so many tests, and the little footnote says, in addition to the above tests, it mentions the Hiroshima weapon and the Nagasaki one. It says those were not tests. But I show you these 2 pictures because they really make a graphic statement of what happened and after this. And my understanding is about what this dome is approximately ground zero. This really got people's attention. Another thing happened later on in 1945, in the fall of 1945. An organization was founded in San Francisco called the United Nations. And at the same time, this raised a lot of concern. And after World War II, attention was drawn to it. And interestingly, the year following the founding of the United Nations, something called the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission was founded. A lot of people don't know about this one. It started, and there were 2 approaches proposed, and they entered into negotiations, and there was no real agreement on which of these 2 approaches. One of these approaches was basically taken by the Western countries, the others by Russia. And does anybody know what caused it they couldn't reach any agreement? What happened in 1949? The Soviet tested their first. They were just waiting. They tested their first one. Negotiations on this quit. But the U.S. didn't give up on it. And I think that was a good point. And so President Eisenhower in 1953 gave what we may have all known about his Adams peace speech, where he proposed an international agency for atomic energy to be under the general umbrella of the United Nations. And the key thing here we're talking about is this verification of peaceful use of nuclear material. From this comes what's now known as IAEA safeguards. It starts from that main point in his speech. By the way, I believe the 50th anniversary of the IAEA, they actually had the speech on display. And it really is an interesting document to see, because you can see where it's been scratched through, and it's really interesting. No teleprompters. So the Atoms for Peace speech started actually the setting up the IAEA, and this is the process that had to happen. The U.S., in order to be involved internationally with nuclear affairs, actually had to change its own domestic law. So if the U.S. is going to be one of the driving forces behind it, inside the U.S. there had to be some changes made. Drafting the IAEA statute is just the governing rules of the agency, more like a constitution. It's how the agency is supposed to operate. And they began it. It took them 1 year to start drafting, to get it approved, and then the statute to enter into force. This is light speed. I don't know how long it would take to do something like this in these days and times. And so, and about the same time, there was talk going around, where are we going to locate this place? Where are we going to locate the IAEA? What's a good place? And right now, at that point, the UN was about 10 years old, 12 years old, and another event happened in 1957. The only country after World War II to be vacated by the Russians was Austria. Okay, the Russian left some of the other, was formerly known as the Eastern Bloc. That happened in about 1989, 1990 for the rest of them, or to have a major political influence. But Austria they did leave Austria. And at that same time, there were talks going on in Austria, very much wanted some type of international presence. And so it was agreed that the IAEA would be located in Vienna, and several other UN organizations also, later on, also headquartered themselves there. The major one was the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, or UNIDO, was also headquartered there. And the very first General Conference was held a few months later in the old Vienna Concert House, or Konzerthaus. And of course, that building is certainly still there. This was made at the time of the General Conference, this picture. Interestingly, if you're aware of the European Union, and they have their own regional safeguards organization, it's called Euratom. They also went through this process of starting their organization in 1957, but earlier in the year. So they were always, whenever the Euratoms, I call them Euratomians, but whenever the Euratom people would come to give a talk, almost for sure one of them would say, and by the way, we started safeguards before the IAEA did. So it's always one of their slides on their presentation, so make sure you knew that they were first. Well, I got a lot of war stories about those things too. I have to be careful to keep you on track. The original agency headquarters were in the old Grand Hotel in Vienna, down in the middle of the center of Vienna, in what's called the First District, the center city. And although I didn't include it in my bio, I had an initial contract and went to the agency in the late 70s, helping build an information system, and that was the door I went through for about a year and a half. And now it's a big fancy shopping area, shopping stores are in there now. They didn't make the hotel, but it was a very interesting place to work. Some people, they just used the rooms. They didn't modify them. So some rooms had bathtubs, you know. One guy had his file, and he had all these files lined up in the bathtub, you know. And some rooms didn't have facilities at all. So it was really an interesting environment, very close and I'm just thinking of another way how things changed in international safety. And this is the personal thing. You would see everybody every day, because we were in such tight quarters, and you get on an elevator and everybody would say good morning, usually in German, and when you leave the elevator they say goodbye. And in the new building where the IAEA moved in 1979, that stopped happening. The Austrians built that is called the Vienna International Center, and that's spelled correctly if you know the British spelling. And all of the UN organizations in Vienna moved there in the fall of 1979, and that's where it's still headquartered. They have had even some building expansions since. They've added on conference buildings. So mechanically, that's how the IAEA has progressed. I also want to cover the relationship with the United Nations. If you ask the lawyers, and the IAEA has lawyers, they will say the IAEA technically is not a UN organization, but in the UN family. It's much easier to say UN, and that was one reason why I chose UN blue for the background, because I'm here even though I'm working for different companies and contracts, I'm here as simply a former staff member. So didn't want to put any, and I can't use the IAEA logo anymore. So, but this is the relationship the IAEA has with the United Nations, and as a result, how it's set up, since the agency is an autonomous organization, it has its own governing bodies. It does not answer to the General Assembly. It answers to the Security Council, but only to provide information. In other words, if you think about the IAEA being organized, the IAEA has a Board of Governors, which is the equivalent of the Security Council of the General Assembly. The IAEA, excuse me, got that wrong. The IAEA has a General Conference, which is the equivalent to the General Assembly, and then a Board of Governors, which is similar to analogous to the Security Council. The Board of Governors takes care of operation during the entire year, as well as the General Conference addresses all major issues. They meet once a year. But people ask, well, doesn't the IAEA have any real teeth? Well, the only teeth for enforcement, besides being publicly making a statement and either call it embarrassment, call it what you want, just publicly making a statement of a situation in a country. They also would go to the Security Council for the possibility of sanctions, but it's the Security Council that implements the sanctions, not the IAEA. And there have been a lot more of the sanctions and going to the Security Council happened a lot more during my career than before or after. And I got involved with a lot of that. It was really a lot of interesting stuff, so we can talk about that later. But please ask me questions as we go along. But if I get stuck off on, my colleagues know, if I get stuck off on that, we will really be late to lunch. Oh, and I meant to say that, if you know Kim Gilligan, Kim is also a former agency staff member. So I have a former colleague. I'm a colleague. You're smart. Yeah. These are the three main areas of work of the IAEA. And later on, I should show you how, over time, it used to be each organization had their own directors, their own deputy director generals, and they pretty much stay to do their own business. Safeguards goes off and gets to be Safeguards, which is about a little under a third of the staff are Safeguard staff, more like 600 or 700 staff involved with the Safeguard side. But later on, as you see the progression of Safeguard, these other departments start having a little more importance. And they had to start learning how to play well together too. But this is where we ended with, this is where Safeguards currently is now. And I'm going to show how we've gotten to this. And some of this has been done all along, but there's a political aim, a technical, and a technical aim and a technical task. And depending upon the type of safeguards implemented in the state and where you are in time, not all of this was done. But this is where the agency finally has a ribbon, the road, gone to. Let me go ahead, and the main one here is, this is the inspections, verifying corrections and completeness. Compliance with safeguards obligations. This is what's actually in a safeguards agreement that says you need to do this. And then certainly the aim here is, in the event that there's something not being done correctly, detect it in a timely manner. And people will right away say, due to the nature of how IAEA safeguards are applied, timely detection is really an impossibility. Well, you have to tell me what is timely. I would say timely within the limitations, restrictions, or requirements of what's provided for in the safeguards arrangements that the country has. Because there are some timing issues that can come into play. But with new technologies, detection is pretty dang possible. It was the IAEA, for example, that discovered the the undeclared plutonium programs in North Korea. Sometimes that doesn't come out in the news, but it was the agency who found that out. But safeguards developed, and I don't know if you're aware of, prior to NPT, there was still safeguards, and it was called the Agency Safeguard System. The first inspections were in 1961 at a research reactor. It was in Norway. And in that early 60s, there was also an inspection out at Oak Ridge at the graphite reactor. I've seen pictures of it. I don't know what they were really doing, but I've seen the pictures. And then the system was expanded, and the final result of the safeguards in the late 60s was called, we called it non-NPT safeguards, or it's called Insert 66 type safeguards. And I'll explain what that insert thingy means later. If you're not familiar with that, that's agency terminology, and I'll tell you about that. Then, a lot of people don't give Ireland credit for it, but it was an idea in Ireland that started, and people know that. You'd be amazed how many times I talk about that and people don't know that Ireland was the initiator of NPT back in 1958. And then this is almost light speed too, in terms of such a major legal agreement and treaty to be put into force, ratified, entered into force, enough ratification, all the 5 weapon states, and enough ratification to have it entered into force in 1970, and it took another couple of years for the first information that's required in the agreement to be provided to to the agency. And 1995 was extended indefinitely at the review conference held in New York. And there's something called the additional protocol. And so if you're more policy people, you understand more what protocols are. And I've got copies of them if you want to see them. They're also, has anybody ever been to the agency's website? Then I'll show you some stuff on there too. This is what's an insert. It means information circular. And it's kind of hard to talk about safeguards without using that expression. And I just went out online and thought, well, I'll at least show, now here's the timeline. I thought about this about 2 o'clock one morning. So here's another way to show the timeline of international safeguards. I'm going to start with what's the very first one, and what's the most recent one, and then what's happened in between. This is a span of from 1959 until 2014. And you can see not all of these are related to safeguards. There might be, a country may wish to communicate to the rest of the world that there were a lot of things, that it has implemented a new safety procedure in its power reactor system. It will use this mechanism, they'll write to the IAEA, say, please communicate to the rest of the other member states of the IAEA that we've done this. And it'll get an insert number and it'll be communicated. These are readily available online on the agency's website. And you can search by country, you can search by insert number, I think you can search by topic. The key ones, I had put inserts 1 and 2. The first one is a list of all the inserts. And the last one is, that I found was, yesterday was as of 11 this month, the Iranians published something about their remarks having to do with IAEA safeguards being implemented in Iran. I didn't read the document, that's just what's out there. It makes for interesting reading. Also, some of these, if you have a lot of trouble going to sleep, some of these are excellent eye resters. Even if you like legal documents. But the main ones from a safeguard standpoint, insert 26 was the very first safeguards document, how to do safeguards. That was the one that was heavily modified and later it was republished as insert 66, which we call non-NPT or insert 66. These were the safeguards prior to the NPT treaty, which is insert 140. And then the last two, the major safeguards documents are insert 153, which is the model safeguards agreement for all under NPT, and then the model additional protocol, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So if you go out there and start looking, you can find that Finland had the very first comprehensive safeguards agreement. I think it's insert 157. It's in the 15s somewhere. And you'll find other agreements these are all public knowledge. There's nothing secret about them. There are other legal documents that are attached to this agreement that are confidential, and so I'm not allowed to talk about them. The next document that comes behind, there's a document for implementation of safeguards in the state, and then for each facility there's a document, and those are definitely confidential. But you'll find these out there, and you can read what safeguards. The material that was removed from you saw the slide earlier, Ray was talking about all the material that was brought from the U.S. back from all those different countries, and we were involved with that too. There is actually an insert out there, I think it's in the 360 range, I can't remember the exact number, 365 or something like that, that talks about, that was the agreement under which the material was provided by the United States. So you can find those supply agreements and the conditions under which the material was supplied and under which it has to be returned. But a lot of the material was provided in the 1950s and 60s prior to NPT. The countries already had the material. With NPT, they also had an NPT obligation when the material was returned to the United States. They didn't have to just meet the U.S. requirements, they also had an international requirement. And I think the comment that you made was on, it all had to do with origin of the material. It was U.S. origin. It was U.S. origin material. The IAEA doesn't really care about the origin of the material. It's not part of IAEA safeguards. If it's in your border or under one of your safeguards agreements, that is what's under safeguards. So the agency doesn't track that. Yes, please.
Yeah, and all that material, when it came back, any obligations of the state that it came from, all of those obligations followed that material back to the U.S. So everything from every one of those countries we brought material back, all had peaceful use clauses associated with how that material could be used. So it all has to be segregated. That material has to be, we have to ensure that that material goes for peaceful use purposes. And we can't go back into any weapons program.
That's exactly right. There are obligations you'll find those obligations written in the Safeguards Agreement. Yes, please.
I actually had a question going back to Eisenhower's speech, really, when the Adams for Peace kind of set up a two-track system, one for the spread of nuclear materials for peaceful purposes, but he also suggested the IAEA. This question arose for me with a paper I wrote recently. The United States had to modify the Atomic Energy Act of 46 and 54 for the Adams for Peace program to commence. What I understood, although I never saw this explicitly stated in any of my sources, was that the United States made these countries agree to peaceful end uses for the material that they transferred. But then once those agreements expired, those safeguards agreements would be transferred to the agency, which it was assumed at that point would be established. Is that correct?
That's a yes or no question.
Okay.
Basically, yes.
Okay.
But I think the operating paragraph, I've got it with me, in Instruct 153, I believe it's paragraph 24, and in which it says when a country accepts NPT, if they have any other safeguards agreements in place, those are, upon ratification of their safeguards agreement, those agreements are held in abeyance.
Mm-hmm.
And they are responsible for all of the material under that agreement. And at such time, if they ever decide to withdraw from NPT, those agreements wake up again. And
Okay.
I'm not a lawyer, so that's the only way I pretty much can say it. What's non-abeyance? Unabeyance. Anyway, I can't. But that's basically what happens. Now, there's if you look at some of those older Insert 66 type agreements, under supply agreements, conditions of supply are clear. And when I talk a little bit more about NPT, you'll see condition of supply is clear. It must be under safeguards. If it's not under safeguards, no supply takes place. So, but the NPT did take in consideration that they would be prior safeguards agreements in existence. And what do you do with those? North Korea had, if you look, it's public knowledge, North Korea was under non-NPT type safeguards prior to agreeing to NPT. Those agreements were held in abeyance. And then there's still a difference, whereas North Korea say they've withdrawn, the IAEA hasn't acknowledged the withdrawal. Well, if the agency said, if the agency put those other two agreements back into force, that would be a de facto acknowledgement of the withdrawal, so they're not going to do that. But it would give them some more rights to go in and start inspecting, because those agreements are still active.
Okay.
But then again, the North Koreans could withdraw from those as well. So there's some pretty smart lawyers at the agency. Does that address? I think I don't know if it really addresses the question you're asking.
Yes, it did. I was thinking, I couldn't recall what the agreements were called. They're agreements for cooperation with the United States. Just like in the early 50s, right when the Adams for Peace got started, before the agency issued Infosert 66, where the United States was carrying out its own inspection regime, but they did so, from my understanding, knowing that they would probably not renew those safeguards agreements and that the agency would take over. So I think we're saying the same thing.
Well, you can actually look, once the agency, you're correct, those agreements prior to the agency will not be recorded as an insert, or not be, but you will notice, if you start looking at these agreements very early on, in the 20s, you'll see supply agreements, and they'll mention the country, who's supplying what to which country. And so they start popping up even in the 1950s. And many of them also have a time limit. And you'll see an addendum or a revision to the agreement, an extension of the agreement, or you'll see suspension of the agreement. Very common, you'll see a suspension of agreement when a country signs NPT. Then there'll be a whole series of suspensions of all of their previous agreements. Once a bunch of processes take place, you can start suspending old safeguards agreements once you're sure that they've declared everything under their NPT agreement. You'll see those too. There'll be suspensions, extensions, and there'll be terminations of agreements too. But well, talking about non-NPT safeguards is another couple days we can.
Thank you.
Oh, no problem. In fact, I'm going to talk a little about what non-NPT is. And this is the history of the expansion. We're going to talk about the history of non-NPT safeguards, of when it began and what the expansions involved. Back you see, in 1966, it was decided enough changes had happened, they really had to make a major revision. Instead of republishing Insert 26, the agency decided just to publish brand new Insert 66. And then prior to NPT, there were at least 30 states. It depends upon, if this is the case, how many states were under non-NPT safeguards? Well, is it a country that's being inspected or one that's party to an agreement? Because you can be party to an agreement and not be inspected if you're the provider of the material. And boy, there are a lot of real challenges implementing safeguards under non-NPT. And it's agreement-based. This is the biggest challenge. It's agreement-based. And coming back to your question about their material, things that are safeguarded under non-NPT, people think it's just nuclear material. It's not material. It's material, equipment, non-nuclear materials, technological information, and facilities. Any one of those you can have an agreement on. And the concept is if an item under safeguards enters a country and it's safeguarded and inspected, anything that touches that item also becomes subject to safeguards. You provide the design for a facility. Well, the minute you do that, when you build a facility, the design documents are what's safeguarded, but you build a facility, since it's built with the safeguarded documents, the facility now is subject to safeguards. You put fuel in it from some other source, the fuel becomes subject to safeguards because it's in a facility. You can see how it works. And you would expect safeguards sort of spread across the country and cover it. That's not the case. And so right now there are 3 states currently that are being inspected under the Insert 66, the non-NPT regime, and that's Israel, India, and Pakistan. India, if you go online, you can find a lot of interesting new safeguards agreements with the United States for the supply of material. And so that one, and I was in Vienna about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and even talked with a friend of mine about it. There's a lot of activity going on there with what type of arrangements going to happen, how they're going to be implementing safeguards. And that's internal to the IAEA, but you can find the agreements out there on just search by India. You'll see the most recent one that's out. This has to do with supply of the material and how safeguards will be applied. The NPT, I know about NPT, but the main thing here, coming from the way non-NPT safeguards are implemented, the next progression in the history of safeguards is with NPT. The key thing is the second bullet. Safeguards is applied to all material in the state. And that kind of touches base what was said earlier. If you control the nuclear material, you're done. You've got everything. You make sure the material is controlled. That's the most difficult thing to acquire. It is relatively easy to make certain types, like a gun type device, fairly easy to make. So if you control the material, your job's finished. And that worked real well for about 25 years. Well, actually, no, a little less than 25 years. And at the same time, we have the nuclear weapon states now becoming involved. I speak of nuclear weapon states here. I'm speaking of the 5 nuclear weapon states as defined in the context of NPT. That's China, France, United Kingdom, Russia, and the United States. But everyone commits to export controls. And on export controls, if you want to look up Insert 207 and 209 and 234, you can find some real interesting stuff on dual-use material and things that are subject to export control. I didn't want to get into that one in this discussion here. And the last one is pursue negotiations on nuclear disarmament. There's one country that every year at the General Conference, they begin their presentation by reminding all of the weapon states that they need to do more work on this. Same country makes the same statement every single time. Please don't ask me the name of the country. Okay. Again, this is basically under safeguards agreements under NPT. Everything is subject to safeguards. And interesting, this is something the lawyers always like to say. It's not limited to material declared. Because it's all nuclear material, and it's up to the IAEA to decide if it should be declared or not. Some countries will declare something, and what are you declaring that for? Certain compounds of uranium, maybe prior to what the agency defines as what they need for full safeguards application. For nuclear weapon states, however, their safeguards agreements are different because it's implementing safeguards in a state that already has weapons. If you want to make a note, insert 288 is the U.S. agreement. If you want to go read one, it's insert 288. You can always find it by looking on the internet. And insert 193 is the European Union. And I think 327, I can remember, 327 is France or Russia, one of the two. But they, it's kind of good to go read one. And you can actually, to read and insert a safeguards agreement from a country, a non-nuclear weapon state, and compare what a nuclear weapon state safeguards agreement looks like. Now, I mentioned non-NPT had some limitations. NPT was proven to have some limitations as well. There's restricted access, routine access. An inspector wants to arrive at a facility, really wasn't able to go everywhere they thought they needed to be able to go. I was in one country just prior to them joining NPT, and it's one of those, once in a while, this is a little war story, once in a while you make a statement, you realize, oops, I could be fired for that. And people at the agency rarely get fired, but if you make the wrong political statement, that's a quick way out. Or steal from the commissary. I think that was the other big one. Or steal a lot from the commissary. But we were driving by, and I could tell I could tell it was we drove by a facility, big barbed wire fence, concertina wire, and all that. And I could see the electrical supply sections on the outside. It had to be an enrichment plant. It just had to be the way they had put all the services on the outside. The driver said, "My golly, that's an enrichment plant." I went, "Oh no." The driver, of course, just raised his eyebrows and didn't say anything, and I thought something was going to come of it, and it never did. But I was still young then, I guess. Anyway, there were less attention to smaller quantities, specifically material that had been exempted from safeguards for some reason, like research purposes, and it turned out that quite a few countries, some that you may not even imagine, use small quantities for some very interesting things. It could be, well, one case was a professor who thought, "Hey, I think I'm going to look at this," and he's just curious. But it turned out that what he was doing really raised a bunch of flags, and eventually it was all resolved. But these were the limitations, and the experience with Iraq really showed it. I don't know if you've seen these or not, but this pretty much did it. This is at 2 acre. This is prior. This is what was under safeguards in Iraq. Fuel fabrication facility, a reactor, two reactors. Anybody ever seen this one? And you can see the next one is what was actually there. In this case, though, and it's an amazing berm to get into it down here, but tunnels and things to get into a big earth where they great earth movers. They can move earth. Inspectors were not permitted to even say, "By golly," make a comment like I did. If I made that kind of comment in this facility, then it really would have been repercussions. The other country was a real friendly bunch of folks, so it was okay. So along came the additional protocol, and again we're seeing the progression. Now we moved in safeguards. We moved from the Adams Peace speech back in 1953. Got the agency starting in 57. Two types of safeguards: the transition from in pre-NPT, non-NPT to NPT, and now the additional protocol came along to provide more information, more access, and measures to improve efficiency. And this is what's really new. And this caused a bunch of interesting, also, changes in safeguards in the agency. It changed in culture. Before this, it was primarily, it was only related to nuclear material. And so it was all facility oriented. Is the facility within compliance? And based on how all the facilities in the state being in compliance, is the state in compliance with safeguards requirements? And then all the information systems were built that way. Now you add the additional protocol, which is very, very textual, large maps, all sorts of additional electronic information available. You need an information system for that too. So then you can imagine the IT needs increased. But I mentioned culture. There are, inspectors, and again, inspection was not my major job. Inspectors who were dedicated, the best people in the world, but they could handle nuclear material accounting, accountability, accountancy, all of the measurements, the sampling, but to now open and start looking broader, take a broader view, that took a culture change for a lot of folks. And some of the report, I'll mention later, we started writing something called state evaluation reports. It turned out that being able to write in English became very critical. And sometimes you would get a report for a state that would literally be 500-600 pages long. And the idea to look at it not from the narrow nuclear material accountancy, which still, by the way, is the cornerstone of agency safeguards, still the cornerstone of safeguards is the accountancy side. But to add all of this other information as well and all the analysis that goes with it, which is why the agency now has information analysts, not only in the Division of Information Management, but also out in the additional, the inspector divisions as well. So a whole new function needed to be added. And they added senior inspectors, even another hierarchy of level of inspector had to be added to coordinate and coordinate all of this analysis work as well. So you're talking about personnel issues, and remember when you say the word senior, that carries a certain grade, and that grade carries a certain much of approvals you have to hire someone for that grade. So a lot of aspects when simply because of the results of what Iraq did. I just had a thought. I guess had Iraq not done what they did, it's still, the additional protocol is a good thing. It's definitely necessary. And as a result of the analysis of every country and doing a safeguards evaluation report for every country, a lot of tiny little things started popping up. And so, and countries, again, I'm not going to mention the names, which you thought would have been, by golly, they're squeaky clean. Then you'd find out, hey, they had a professor over here doing something. What were they doing? And we were able to, the good thing is the agency was able to track the nuclear material associated with that. And we have I didn't bring it, I have a very good graph that starts from 1982 and runs to 2005 of tracking one small amount of material that was misused. And because of the tracking the inventories and keeping track, when you ship something, it has to be received and following its path through one country. And it went off the radar and came back. And we could tell, this is that bit that came back. What did they do when it was gone? And another country that we were trying to figure out what was going on in the country, and someone did a look at all of the degrees that a bunch of these students had gone to various countries, primarily Russia, and nuclear engineering, and they were all studying how to increase the efficiency of a reactor, increase the burn up, get more bang for your buck and all that. They had yet to declare a nuclear power program, but by golly, they did. But it turns out 10 years earlier, if you just looked at their degrees, you would say, golly, something's going on here. Of course, they met their safeguards obligations. They declared when they had to declare. Everything went fine. But it just shows how a lot of this, doing that prior to the additional protocol, they went on, no one was thinking of that. You may have seen this one, but this kind of shows, and there's even one change too here, it shows that under classical, original NPT safeguards, this is the part of the critical path to weapons that's concluded. Conversion sort of shaded there because part of it. As of now, you can consider that all blue because there's been a new policy paper at the agency. Conversion has really is now completely under, converted facilities are completely under safeguards instead of some point midway in the process. It's upon receipt of the facility now. But these were the other parts picked up by the additional protocol. This one down here is a real all activities not involving nuclear material. And so I'm just going to go through real quick and show how you can see how declared information, and this is what's provided to the agency, starting in the earliest information provided actually was in the late 60s. That's actually in agency information system. This, you ever heard of the voluntary reporting scheme? It was an interim measure. Look at the date. Just after the first Gulf War, it was an interim measure to say, look, is there any other information we can start garnering, start gathering prior to doing something more permanent, which became the additional protocol. And this was voluntary, and it was reporting on material transfers and equipment transfers, source material transfers, material prior to the starting point of safeguards, and for non-nuclear purposes. And if you can certainly Google that agency's website. There's some Board of Governor documents that cover this. So it happened, and some countries still report under it, but generally it's taken over by the additional protocol. That the illicit trafficking database began in 1995. This was started more by all of the loose material, if you want to call it that, that was around with the breakup of the former Soviet Union. And included radioactive sources, which aren't under agency safeguards, but there were a lot of nuclear materials going back and forth. I got a good war story on that, but I'll save that for later. And then along came the AP in '97, and then this on Neptune and Mauritian production and transfer. This is also a voluntary arrangement. Interestingly, the lawyers say it is voluntary. It's voluntary to subscribe to it, but once you volunteer to subscribe, it's an obligation until such time as you withdraw. And some countries have withdrawn from the voluntary reporting scheme once they have the additional protocol. Although, if you look at it, there's some things covered by the reporting scheme that are not covered by the protocol still. Having to do with, well, that's a whole other talk, but we also, with declared information, along comes non-declared information. At the top, I want to come back to my original talk about those departments that maybe didn't play too well together. Within the Department of Safeguards, of course, you have your inspection activities and everything the inspectors notice, and all complementary, all things related to agency activities from a safeguard standpoint. But what about the other agency departments? If you noticed earlier, one of them had to do with helping countries develop their nuclear program. What about a person goes to a country and they say, you know, we're starting to mine, we got a new uranium mine. How's the Department of Safeguards going to know about that? Someone is there on a technical cooperation mission and hears or sees something related to a nuclear program. Originally, that information just didn't get over to the Department of Safeguards. Now it does. So there is a relationship as other departments go on their travels and see things that are related that could be of need. That's another very valuable information source. Plus these others. Satellite imagery is really cool. And I mentioned the case about the students all studying nuclear programs. And you can use your imagination what third-party sources are, because a lot of times the agency gets information from sources, and they have to deal with it as is, but still some very valuable information comes in. And just show you, I've got a whole other bunch of examples of North Korea. I can show you. It's public. It's open. You know. But there's also some good ones from Iran on how they shrouded the Parshin site and all of that. If you haven't seen those, I'll maybe show you sometime, maybe another time today if you want to see them. But the main thing is, it's very valuable for the agency to use to take a state declaration of what a site, the buildings, and then compare it to what really the satellite image says. And there's been really interesting differences noted. And that's when you send an inspector back and say, okay, go check out what is this building and what it's doing there. And then this technology trade analysis, you all heard of the AQCon network. This is looking for activities going on in international trade, who's dealing with what and where. One quick war story we had of a real big excitement. Someone had located a whole large quantity of zirconium, had been shipped to a country that had no nuclear program, none whatsoever, and just what's going on with it. And the research findings proved that it was not nuclear grade zirconium, it was in powder form, and they made artificial diamonds. They were making search. So, but it was, at least that's what came out. But interestingly, it was found by this open source searching, and of course that caused, from the standpoint of being an information analyst, you find all these really interesting things pop up, and some that aren't very interesting. So why are they asking us this? But you do it all. And what all kind of comes down to is getting away now from the facility approach only, but looking at it from the whole state. And if you look across the bottom, on the left, the state declared information. In the middle, the results of verification. And on the right, additional information sources. And this is basically the process, and the two biggies. And then I think the IAE is very good. I like the expression, but it's no evidence of undeclared, no evidence of diversion. Those upper right corner, upper left corner are the two conclusions that the agency is looking for. And this is basically the process, bottom-up process to accomplish that. And down below here, you probably know what DA and NDA, but ES means environmental sampling. I didn't cover that, but that's a whole other realm of expertise. The environmental sampling expertise and the silent imagery expertise, again, staffing, a whole new set of staff that need to be able to use that technology. They gave all of us training as well in it, but then they brought in the real experts. And they got some cool scanners. I mean, they got some cool equipment. And so, Safeguards Outlook, the agency continues to look at things to make life better, to improve the program, and have it develop as technologies change, and always new challenges are going to arise. There's certainly plenty going on right now. And I'm still actually on time because we started. Okay, good. I'm watching the time. Okay?
No, actually, we're running late again.
Yeah, well,
That clock has not been set forward.
no, I'm teasing. I started 15 minutes late. So. Okay. I want to make I want to give you some personal remarks too, just to let you know that about my own career there, that I never would have expected it to happen. And having been there during some very interesting times. I joined the agency in October 1982, and I walked in, and 2 weeks later they celebrated the 25th anniversary of the agency. I retired in October 2007, and before I left, we celebrated the 50th anniversary. So I got two nice parties. Great people to work with. Never expected to live that much time overseas. And it was real challenging at times, some political differences. One political cultural difference I can mention is, do you ever watch the Olympics and someone walks in and they have Chinese Taipei? You ever seen that? Well, mostly you call it Taiwan, China. Well, it gets drilled into agency staff real quickly. It's Taiwan, China. That's the expression, Taiwan, China. Don't ever say it any other way. And if you ever look on agency listing, just like that listing about the 2 nuclear explosions that weren't tests, every agency listing will list countries. It will never list Taiwan, China as a country. But there's safeguards going on there. Safeguards agreements. There'll be a footnote. The above list, they'll say safeguards are also applied in Taiwan, China, because you can't list Taiwan, China under a title that says state or country. Or then the explosions get really big. So, and the really, you know, and getting the Nobel Peace Prize in 2005 was cool. Seeing your own work being quoted, even though, but the whole time, I mean, the team. When you do a team, and you'll hear a speech at the Security Council, or you hear something on CNN, or you'll hear something internal and say, "Dang, we wrote that," and that goes a long way to making you feel good. And of course, contributing to projects with a lot of worldwide implications. And the prize was really great. And they had a big party as a result. It was awarded in 2 parts to them, and got a cool certificate. It's hanging in my living room. And the monetary, everybody said, what happened to the money? Well, one half went to the Director General, the staff got the other half. And the staff amount, our staff council decided they started the Nobel Cancer Nutrition Fund to do with these objectives. And when they did that, the Norwegian government matched it. So basically, the staff got the full award and all. And I figured it up. I think each staff member qualified as about 0.24 milli-nobles or milli-laureates or something like that. depends on how many staff members at the time were there. Anyway, it was a great experience. And if I had to pick one single highlight, that nails it. And so this is what we talked about, how Safeguard started, how it evolved, you know, looking at this concept of 75 years of, and it's not all 75 years. If you date back to 1946, that's a little less than the full 75 years. And then, again, the website, I encourage you to go look at there. A lot of information out there, a lot of interesting things to read, what's currently going on in the Safeguards world. And inserts are really, I need a 12-step program, I guess, because inserts are fun to read, at least the Safeguards ones. So, and I'm available also for more discussion or talk. Or,
We do have a Q&A question session at the end as well. If you're going to be
Okay,
around for that, we can dive into that. Okay, so in the interest of getting us back a little bit on schedule, let's thank our speaker. So